Okay, so here's the study guide review for 355. All right, so for Chapter 9, Early Studies of Crime and Deviance, they largely focused on what they considered to be biological inherent differences between men and women when it came to how they committed crime. And there's a lot of obviously highly sexist assumptions about women, whether or not they were even able to be perpetrators, whether they were using their feminine guiles to manipulate men into committing crimes. Like a lot of these things were rooted in these kind of biological, psychological predispositions that was assumed to be scientific fact at the time. When it comes to labeling and social deviance, basically becoming a deviant has more to do with the behavior that actually you did, right? It actually has more to do with how people label you or how they, consider you to be deviant and exclude you after a deviant act has taken place. When it comes to feminist perspectives on deviance, they argue that the social context of gender, race, class, all of those intersections, right? Age, all of that fun stuff, that they shape both the causes and the consequences of women's deviant behavior. So it's important to understand the social context into, offending. Okay, so when it comes to this idea of lynching and the myth of the black male rapist, Ida Wells Barnett really argued that lynching was just a way to keep poor black men in a subordinated place, and that this was justified by using the myth that black men were rapists and they were hypersexual and threatening towards white women, right? They were predators. And that's something that as a stereotype has lasted longly to this day. And then rape myths are just, basically social understandings of rape that we learn in the culture that put blame on the victim instead of the perpetrator and often can justify away male aggression towards women. So they'll say things like, oh, well, she asked for it, why was she drinking? Or even, argue that a woman cannot be raped or that, a husband can't rape his wife, those kind of things. Those are the rape myths. When it comes to rape and women's status in society, women that are in the most vulnerable statuses in society, right, the most marginalized, are often the ones that are the, most likely to face victimization. Acquaintance rape is the most underreported form of rape. That's all I'm looking for there. When it comes to stalking, I'm just talking about how there's a relationship between stalking and domestic violence and sexual assault, as well as the fact that 7 out of 10 victims know their stalker in some kind of way. Subculture of violence theory, just arguing that, violence is coming from the social environment that you're raised in. So, men's violence is argued to be, this adaptation to living in an impoverished community. And that, of course, the theory does have a racial and class bias because there's certain assumptions that are made there. But really it's arguing that the normalization of violence comes from the social environment that you live in. Gender socialization, again, just that, oftentimes the way that we're taught to be male or female in the culture, and that tends to, we tend to learn that one is valued more than the other. Political economic theory, there I'm just talking about the fact that, women have been defined as property of men in a lot of societies over time. Intimate partner femicide, so some of the risk factors there. We talked about these, basically being pregnant prior to the abuse or during your pregnancy. Prior abuse by a batterer in a previous month is another risk factor. Presence of a child from a previous marriage, or being estranged from the batterer, right? Those are all risk factors. Gendered pathways just means that there's different ways that men and women kind of fall into committing deviant acts or crimes. And it often has to do with, the kind of different paths and trajectories people are on because of our very gendered society. Alrighty, oh no, wait, sorry. Prisons as gendered institutions. Just that a lot of prison policies are typically fashioned in the way that appeals to what was suitable for men, and women are kind of an afterthought. They just apply the structure that already existed onto women. All right, so chapter 11. Just patriarchy within social institutions, so that kind of institutional discrimination, meaning that it's kind of built into our social institutions that give power and preference and favor to men over women. Political movements are just groups of people that come together to try to challenge the status quo and often use tactics like boycotts or sit-ins or things like that to achieve that. And basically, they want to change society, so they do that by mobilizing people. Okay, so the state being a gendered institution just means that the state itself has certain characteristics that we associate with traditional masculinity, such as being rational, having power, being impersonal and detached, right? Pluralism is just this argument that society is comprised of a lot of different groups that are all kind of equally fighting for power and a voice and influence, so that really it's kind of this, there's many groups and many opportunities for people to kind of express their voice and power, versus the power lead model that says that, typically the people do have some say or autonomy, but overwhelmingly the people that make the majority of our decisions are a very small elite group of people that tend to be the heads of the government, heads of the economy, like corporation heads, like CEOs, or people that were high up in the military. And then feminist critiques of the law, just they argue whether or not the law is neutral or whether or not it has its own patriarchal slant to it. So then rape law, just the idea of these shield laws that make it illegal to bring up the past sexual history of a woman that's in a rape case. And while these things exist, this is an important step for victims to come forward and feel comfortable to testify. The women are still often subjected to painful cross-examinations that attack their character, so that often discourages a lot of women from coming forward, even though those laws are in place. So as far as the women in the government, just that there needs to be more female lawmakers, because there's not, if we're going to ever have equality in representation, then there needs to be a lot more women in elected office. Gender stereotypes socialization, just meaning that, when it comes to politics, we are gender socialized to believe that men are better leaders inherently, biologically, socially. We've just been socialized that way our whole lives. So it makes sense that people have some kind of inherent bias against women in high leadership positions. As far as institutional forces that discourage women's political participation, so the fact that a lot of women that wanted to get into politics did not have support from their party leaders, they weren't incumbents themselves, so they weren't just seeking re-election, but they were seeking election for the first time. Often not having money, right? We talked about this as it was in the film, how if women didn't have money and went to these funders, they would say, oh, you have no one to fund you, then I'm not going to help you. Which is ironic. It's like, oh, so you need money, so I won't give you money. And then as soon as they could raise their own money through, grassroots campaigns or things like Emily's List, then they were able to get money. So, and of course, gender discrimination about female leadership is going to kind of lead into that as well. So the gender gap is the fact that men and women tend to hold different views about certain political issues, and they tend to vote a little bit differently as far as if they register Republican or Democrat. When it comes to gender relations in the military, so gender isn't, when people study gender relations in the military, they're studying obviously the relationship that women face within the ranks of the military, but also women who are military wives, right? So not just those in specifically active service. So, they really look at how obviously women as, are largely in relationships with men that are in the military, their lives are going to be impacted in the way that they have to move quite a bit, right? And as a military family, which makes it very difficult to have your own career, as it's very difficult to uproot a career and start all over. Let's see, what else? Oh, lesbians and gays in the military. Just that over time, obviously, there's more support now. Don't ask, don't tell, and policies before that that did not let people openly serve if they were gays or lesbians, or they would be dishonorably discharged, which is really sad. So, of course, obviously, it's taken a lot of time to get people rights within that institution. The military as a gendered institution just means that it tends to have, again, just like the state, those kind of things that we associate with masculine identity, such as hierarchy, force, violence, aggression, the kind of impersonality thing, right? And then a lot of the values that are considered militaristic also legitimize violence and often sexual aggression as normative. Okay, when it comes to women's community activism and grassroots politics, it means that, when women, they've been trying to look at how women are involved in politics over a long time. Women have often been involved in politics, but it was what they called the licking and sticking, right? The kind of smaller grassroots campaigns that women led that had obviously important political impacts, but often didn't get the kind of credibility or attention that some more like institutional or official political actions would. Okay, so just third wave, just the idea that third wave really focused on multiculturalism or expanding beyond the majority of the perspective being middle class white women and kind of including more and more women from different backgrounds and situations into the fold. The rise of the religious right promoted the ideas of family values and this return to this, kind of Norman Rockwell family with the 2.5 kids, male breadwinner, woman at home, very anti-feminist and homophobic arguments that they carried over into legislation in the 1980s. And media stereotypes about feminism, just the fact that when women are portrayed as feminists in the larger culture, it's not as if they portray them as fair and balanced. They usually portray them as nuts or as lesbians or as people that hate men. So, of course, that affects whether or not women will self-identify as feminist. Okay, so for chapter 13, just the differences here. Liberal being, of course, more focused on individual rights, freedom from discrimination, and equal access to social and political institutions. Socialist, obviously, going to be focusing specifically on not just the power relationships between men and women, but also the economic power relationships between men and women. And radical, which is going to look more at the patriarchal social relations as the primary cause of women's oppression. When it comes to false consciousness, that's really when the subordinate group accepts the dominant view of how things should be, right? It's coming from the elites, versus class consciousness is having an awareness of the material relationship to the capitalist system of production, meaning that the poor people realize they're being screwed. The family is a microcosm. Just, that Marx and Engels were trying to argue that the family itself can be seen as a microcosm of these kind of larger class relations, and the fact that, in the time period they were looking at this, men controlled the economic power within the home. Women would work for wages, but they did not control them. Their husbands did, right? Which was actually a pretty recent thing that has changed. So even within our country. So, they kind of saw it as the men themselves were like the bourgeoisie, the wealthy elite class, because they got all the benefits of the labor. And women, since they didn't get to control it, they were more like the proletariat or the workers that don't get to control what they make from their labor. Radical feminism and the power of patriarchy, just really that, when radical feminists were developing their theory in the 70s, they first were arguing that men's control of women can be explained through how, patriarchal establishments of, these hierarchical values that men have more value, they are more intelligent, they are more inherently filled with worth, affects how we internalize the relationships between men and women. The prism of difference is just the explanation of how social structure of race, class, gender, sexuality, all these other inequalities are part of a complex social structure of how we live, right? Let's see, postmodern feminism, just this essentialism idea that all knowledge comes from a specific time period and that we can only really know what's real by kind of dissecting or, decolonizing a lot of this knowledge that we have. So really nothing is essentially male or female. We've made it that way through our culture. So, even within medicine or science, there's no such thing as objectivity, though, obviously research methods can try and guard against these kind of subjective pushes. But what research you do, how you came to that study, why you wanted to frame your research in that way is all subjective. So, postmodernists don't believe that anything is truly objective. Okay, so then as far as the social construction of language, postmodernists are really trying to study how language is a way that socializes us, how it's constructed, has its own power dynamics within it. So they say that language reflects the social categories and practices that come from a specific time, right? And that it's something that basically is wedded to the time period in which it was created, right? That oftentimes those meanings and values from that time are kind of wedded to the language itself. And then queer theory is really just trying to understand how our narrow heteronormative views of sexuality are too constraining for the actual expression of most people's actual internal desires, so that kind of including under this feminist umbrella, queer theory is expanding this intersectional notion of gender and sexuality and how intertwined they are in how they define each other, to kind of critique and understand the social world that forces people to believe that heterosexuality is normative and natural, and any variation from that is deviant. Okay, so then, as far as the short answer essays, what I'm going to ask you to do here is just briefly outline the differences and the similarities between these different theories. So what I think would be the easiest way for you to organize it is to basically put what is similar and do a short little paragraph about that, and then what is different and go through each one, right? So obviously, liberal, socialist, and radical all came about in the same time period, and multiracial, postmodern, and queer have kind of come about in the same time period as well. So each of those three are pretty similar to each other. But, liberals looking more at changing the structure of the system, while socialists is looking more at the economic issues, and radical is looking at more of the issue of patriarchy. So I want you to kind of explain the nuanced differences between them, but also the ideology that links them together, that women should have equal access and opportunity. Let's see, multiracial, postmodern, and queer, really expanding the scope of how we investigate these things, right? Not just focused on a white middle-class perspective, also not assuming anything inherent about gender, sexuality, sex itself, any of those kind of things, through this postmodern lens of, questioning what is considered established truth. And queer theory, which is really pushing past the boundaries of what's considered normative to, for lack of a better term, queer, the perspective of what is considered normative sexuality. So obviously they are all related, but they're different and nuanced in what they are specifically arguing as related to gender. So that's what I'm looking for there. And then in response to the film, why are there so few women in elected leadership positions? So, the film lays out a bunch of reasons for this. The institutional issues, the kind of cultural issues of how we look at women, how we think about women, how we sexualize women. And then how is this related to other institutions like the family, like the economy, and the body? I mean, I'm basically hinting, big hint at what the answer is here, right? So even if you just stuck to those, that would be enough to answer the question. But basically, how is the fact that there's so few women in elected leadership positions affect institutions like the family? Well, there's still this kind of gender perception that women should stay at home and take care of kids. So women get asked when they try to be in elected office, who's going to take care of your kids? But also it's related to the fact that if few women are legislators, they're not able to push for things like paid family leave or paid maternity leave, which is super normative in pretty much every other country. Things like that. If you don't have many women to voice those things within the halls of power, then that affects the constraints on the institution of the family, like low-cost daycare, things like that. If more women were in elected office, they would push for more family-centric policies. So the same kind of thing with the economy and the body, right? Think about how the economy defines women, how women don't have as much opportunity, how the glass ceiling, even in the flip side of that, the glass escalator, that men are often just pushed into leadership positions over women within female-dominated fields. The fact that, when it comes to the economy, women, and that's again, the, amalgamating together all of women, and mostly like as a representative statistic for white women, but, women earn about 75 cents to the male dollar, which again breaks down by race. But this idea that if more women are in power, then some of these things are going to shift, just like with the perceptions and the sexualization that we have and representations of women's bodies. Same kind of deal. So anyway, that's what I'm looking for there. Hope this helps.